Hello everybody, welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today we're talking about API governance. I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and I'm joined today again by Buddha from Tyke. Hi Buddha, nice to have you back.
Hi Andy, nice to meet you once again.
Once again, yeah, you've become a regular. You presented at the Blueprint event a couple of weeks ago, and we did a session on APIs a couple of weeks ago, which was really good. So you should check it out. It's on the Bright Talk channel. These sessions are designed to be interactive, so please ask as many questions as you like using the question function at the bottom of your screen. I'll endeavour to ask Buddha at the end of the session in the time allocated for Q&A. Just a quick note on housekeeping. If you have any problems with the stream at all, if it cuts out, it shouldn't do. But obviously, hot weather and lack of bandwidth and all these kind of things, just hit a refresh in the browser and you should jump straight back in. However, without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to feature presenter today. Over to you, Buddha.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I'm really glad to be back once again. Love these discussions. And like you say, today we're going to be tackling something very, very exciting, although traditionally it's not considered an exciting thing, and we'll get into that. So let me start off, as you usually do, by sharing my screen. There we go. Here we go, and share. All right. I hope this is all visible. I'm going to go into presenter.
All good, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone. Glad to have you with me. I am joining you today from Singapore, which is now heading towards a nice little lovely evening. The topic of today's webinar is going to be about rethinking API governance to power your API-first business strategy. I am Buddha, product evangelist at Tyke. Tyke is an API management platform which we are providing. We're powered by an open source gateway and complete with a dashboard and a developer portal for your complete full life cycle API management needs. If you need anything specific on that, we can talk about that later on. But that's who I am. And diving straight into what we're going to be covering today, I'll start off with a bit of an introduction, which I already have, and then go into defining what API governance is, some of the driving factors behind why that is important today. Then we'll talk about building a robust API governance plan and what that might entail for you. It's probably not going to be exhaustive in nature, but it is going to be covering some of the key considerations. Then we'll look at API management platforms and how they can be an enabler for your API governance plan. If you haven't already considered it, how they sort of fit in, what benefits can they bring to you, how can they make your life a little bit easier when you're trying to create this plan of action for your organization. And then finally, we will conclude with a Q&A session. So feel free to make use of the chat and the Q&A function on the right of your screen. Once we are done with the session, Andy is probably going to be serving those questions towards me, and I'll hopefully be able to answer them to the best of my abilities. So with that, let's start at the very beginning, which is going to be defining what API governance is. And really, historically, this is one of those topics which tends to be considered a little bit, well, not exactly fun. It's something that is a little bit mundane, something a little bit boring. It's like you're talking about policies and you're talking about regulations and standards and best practices and things that you have to put in and guardrails and all of these things. And when you think about API-first businesses, that's not something that you consider as that's not what I've signed up for. I've signed up for building these amazing new products, and that's not the fun part of it. Are you really telling me that this is going to make my business grow? It's going to be the defining factor that is going to scale up my business and make my business a success. Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. That's exactly what I'm going to be telling you, that's what API governance is going to enable for you. It is going to be the driving force behind the success of your API-first business. In order for us to understand a little bit, we'll touch upon why that is in a short while. I'll go into the more bookish or the dictionary sort of definition of API governance, and I hope this doesn't scare you, but I will go through it nonetheless. So what is API governance? It's the establishment of policies and continuous monitoring of their proper implementation by the members of the governing body of an organization. It includes the mechanisms required to balance the powers of the members with associated accountability and their primary duty of enhancing the prosperity and viability of the organization. So I'm pretty sure that is enough, and I will just make my way away, and this is all you need to know. No, we'll come back to this. This obviously feels like a mouthful, but it's quite wordy. But in essence, this is what we are looking at from an API governance perspective. But I'll try and make your life a little bit easier through the course of this presentation, and sort of try to make sense of what this really means. And in order for us to do that, I think it's important for us to sort of take a step back and understand some of the context around API governance. So let's start first by understanding what really drives businesses. What do businesses really care about? And I really call it the 3 S's. I tend to use these quite a lot because to me, these tend to be the pillars that sort of drive some of the conversations around what we should or should not be doing within a business. These are sort of the things that propels the decision-making process within an organization, both from a product development perspective as well as customer acquisition, and pretty much encapsulates overall what a business is trying to do, which is trying to achieve stability, some form of reliability with your product, achieving security. You want your product to be secure. And finally, looking at the scalability of your product and your business, because you're really looking to service more clients as you move along. You're making a transition from a small business potentially to larger enterprises, and you need to have these 3 things in place to be able to really succeed. Now, beyond this, there are a few driving factors that have sort of resulted in the uptick of API governance in our landscape. And one of the terminology that you tend to really hear a lot with digital businesses these days is the term digital transformation, almost to the point of it being overused to a certain extent. But what it really means is that the landscape, the digital landscape has been evolving and it's been changing. It has already come a long way. It is changing at the point, and it will continue to do so over the next few years or decades, however long we are part of the digital landscape, which probably is going to be a long time. So just taking a quick peek into some of the driving factors that have sort of led to the emergence or has driven the importance of adopting API governance needs within an organization. And the first thing is really, like I said, digital transformation, or the evolution of needs or evolution of requirements within an organization. And the first key thing there has been around the need to to provide an omni-channel experience. What that really means is you're no longer looking to service users on a single platform. You're no longer looking at just creating a web-based application and you're completely done. You're potentially looking at consumers interacting with your product, both, say, from a website, potentially, or a web application. You're looking at a mobile application. You're potentially, even if you're in a financial sector or a banking sector, you might be looking at an ATM machine acting as an input system. You might be looking at chatbots. You might be looking at VR-based systems in the future as well. So it is truly an omni-channel experience that you're catering for. You're looking at multiple touch points that the users can use to interact with your product. So you need to cater for that as a big need that has emerged over the last decade or so. Then businesses have been expanding. You're no longer looking at a business that is purely defined by the geographical boundaries of a single location. You're potentially moving across different regions because your user base is truly global. And that has again led to the advent of multi-cloud vendors or multi-cloud requirements, which now you need to think about what kind of services are available. You've got the likes of AWS, you've got the likes of Azure, you've got the likes of GCP. All of these different cloud providers are now available, and you need to really think about how you can make the most out of those solutions that have been provided to you. They definitely bring with them certain challenges, which we'll be looking at in the next segment. But it is something that you need to cater for now, especially when you're looking at a multi-region and a multi-vendor environment. And then finally, a third key driving factor has been the changing architectural styles. And this is a little bit more on the technical aspect, but really we've sort of seen a transition from a more monolithic sort of an approach in architectures of API products to something which is a little bit more microservices driven. Now, which is better, which is worse for you is probably going to be dependent on the kind of business you're running and the scale of your business. But these are differing styles that have emerged and have had their own benefits as well as challenges that have sort of led to the need for some of these considerations that we're going to be talking about later on in this presentation. Then finally, because of these evolving needs, we've also seen that these have led to certain complexities emerging as well. So what are those complexities? We start off with, now with different architectural styles, your product is now expanding, you're catering to multiple channels, multiple platforms, multiple regions, which typically has led to creation of products that are inherently a lot more complex than they used to be before. You've got multiple components, which are essentially delegated to perform specific activities, which is one of the best ways to actually go about doing it, because it makes your system a lot more scalable in that fashion. But it is a lot more complex of a system that you now need to cater for, now need to manage, and you need to deal with. Moving on to that, then once you start looking at things like multiple regions and multiple cloud, depending on the kind of business you might be in or the kind of vertical that you might be servicing, you have to think about compliance requirements. What are the compliance requirements within your own region? When you're moving to a new region, what kind of compliance requirements do you need to adhere to there? We had a talk a couple of weeks ago where we really looked at dealing with data sovereignty as you scale. And I think this is where that comes in a big factor when you're trying to service, when you're trying to grow across different regions and across different cloud providers, even for that matter. So that sort of makes it quite important. Then finally, we've got larger teams, and this is where we've seen that now that we've got these multiple components and adherence requirements, more and more complex products being created, there's been a need to have larger teams or more teams essentially tackling these challenges. In a lot of cases, you tend to find that there are specific services that are being handled specifically by one individual team. And across multiple services, you have individual teams sort of tackling all of those requirements on an ongoing basis. So now you've got the challenge of managing these larger teams as well within your organization as you expand out with your evolving needs. So with all of that in place, I think one of the biggest things that you need to think about is what could potentially go wrong. And if you really look at some of these complexities, there could be, I think one of the biggest thing is the risk that things might fail. The more number of components, the more number of touch points, the more number of people that are involved in a process of development or maintenance of a product, typically, while it makes it easier in certain ways, it also adds on to a level of risk of failure, because now you've got multiple points and multiple things that could go wrong, or multiple things that need to work nicely in order for your holistic product to sort of work coherently. But at the same time, you don't want to just look at the negatives. There is obviously a lot of positive that comes with having these larger teams. You do not want to sacrifice the speed of development. You do not want to sacrifice the scale at which you are building out your product. So there are those two competing aspects that you need to think about, which sort of have been the driving forces behind API governance and what it sort of is trying to accomplish with an organization. So now with all of these in place, if I were to take another stab at trying to define what API governance is, I feel like it distills down to just these two main things, which is putting policies in place such that it is easy for people to do the right thing, but hard to do the wrong thing. So, of course, this is a lot more simplified version of what was in there at the beginning, I think, but at the gist of it, this is kind of what we are trying to do. We want to make sure that we want to put in the guardrails in place so that things do not go wrong when you've got these multiple touch points inside your organization, multiple teams handling your product. But at the same time, we want to encourage people or enable them to actually to perform at the best of their ability, best of their potential, so that the business keeps innovating, the business keeps building, the business scales up in a secure and reliable manner on an ongoing basis. And that's what API governance is trying to tackle. This is essentially what API governance tends to be all about. It is about managing or enabling change within an organization. So of course, there will be typical questions around, okay, how do you define? So when we say the right thing, what does that actually mean? When we talk about the wrong thing, what does that mean? What kind of policies do we need to put in place? What kind of people should be involved? And that's where we go into the next segment. Once we start looking at building out an API governance plan. So in this segment, we're going to be talking about what that plan might look like. What are the different considerations that you might have to think about as you move along? And as I said at the beginning, this isn't going to be an exhaustive plan because, again, different businesses differ, of course. You might have different needs. You might have more than these. You might need a subset of these. But I just wanted to sort of elucidate about 5 of these different points that we think, or we've seen more often coming up in conversations around API governance, that has sort of helped in businesses thinking out or building out a strategy that would enable them to really drive change within their organization in a reliable manner. So these 5 key considerations that we're going to be talking about starts off with access control. Then we go into ongoing maintenance and enhancement and how you can tackle those. Then touching upon compliance and regulations like we touched upon previously, and how you can sort of get around some of those or address some of those. Reporting as a big aspect, because again, we are talking about businesses. We're not just talking about technical aspects of product. We are talking about how they can grow. And finally, we'll take a look at the team structure as we move along, because we are really looking at organizations with multiple teams. So who is going to be the one who's going to be owning this governance plan, and how you can sort of address that. So let's go into the details of each one of them. We'll start off with access control as one of the key considerations. So as you can imagine, when we talked about what are some of the complexities, we spoke about we spoke about multiple teams having access to the product. So and the product itself having different components. So who has access to what is a very, very important question that needs to be addressed. This again is another enabler where depending on the kind of access people have, they might have different privileges within an organization, and therefore depending on those privileges, things could go right, things could go wrong. And really, it's not all about restricting people, but it's also about letting or allowing or enabling people actually to do and perform their tasks to the best of their abilities without being really lost within the administrative aspect of managing the product. So within the segment, we typically tend to see one main access control policy, which is called role-based access control. This tends to be a little bit more popular across organizations. And what it really entails is you set out different roles within an organization, and then associated to those roles would be different permissions, privileges, and restrictions about what users who are part of that role can or cannot do. It's not tied to a user, it's tied to a role. Therefore, a user can have that particular role or move across different roles over a period of time. And based on that, they can have their own privileges or restrictions as you go along. So I think this, again, adds that layer of guardrails, again, where it pretty much clearly defines in terms of what you can or cannot do when you're touching or working on the product in terms of permissions. The next segment, the next sort of like an extension of role-based access control, or rather the more holistic look at role-based access control, we are looking at attribute-based access control, which is really looking at permissions and roles as an attribute itself, where you can tackle a lot of different things around your access control based on it. So the key difference here is the level of granularity that you can get with attribute-based access control, or ABAC as the terminology is. And really that's where sort of these two differ a little bit. One is more towards a role-based approach. The other one is role plus several other attributes that you can define within an organization in order to set those guardrails. So it really comes down to what level of control that you want within your organization. Moving right along, on to consideration number 2, which is ongoing maintenance and enhancement. So I think an important thing to realize with API governance as well is that these aren't policies or rules that you're sort of putting in place one time and you're done with it. That's not how it works. It's essentially an ongoing process. And this is, again, a typical mistake that we see a lot more, where a lot of times people are really thinking about the API development and launch process as opposed to thinking about API that being sort of an initiator of the overall journey that your API product business is going to be taking in. So you have to think about that entire journey, not just at the point of launch or development, but also moving forward. How are you going to be tackling some of the challenges that are going to be arising just by the existence or even the evolving needs of your API product? And that's where your continuous improvement sort of comes in, where you need to think about your versioning strategy. What are you going to be doing? How are you going to be looking at newer versions as your product evolves? And tied very closely to that is a retirement strategy. So when newer versions sort of come into play, how do you tackle the previous and the older versions? Are you still going to be making that available? Are you going to be phasing those out? What kind of backwards compatibility do you need? Is it going to be creating breaking changes? How are you going to be communicating that to your users? Is there a migration strategy that is going to be needed associated with this new update and upgrade around consumption of your information? So all of these sort of fits in to your ongoing maintenance considerations that you need to think about moving forward. The other part is, in terms of enhancement, you also need to think about typical terminologies around GitOps, or I think a more usual terminology is around the continuous integration, continuous deployment. This is a little bit more to do with your ongoing deployment across multiple environments. If you've got updates, and again, you're working in an organization which most likely has multiple teams working on it, then having some of these CI/CD workflows makes it a lot more easier and reliable to be able to make these changes. What kind of version control systems do you need to put in place as well when it comes to developing your product itself? And beyond that, how do you have these CI/CD pipelines that would enable continuous integration in a very, very simple and seamless manner, as opposed to having to really think about it every single time you're making the smallest of changes? So it's really about efficiency and driving that efficient change on an ongoing basis with these CI/CD workflows that you can have in place. And then finally, something a little bit less sometimes overlooked is conventions. I think it's quite important. Again, in large-scale organizations, you need to think about what kind of conventions, not the naming conventions, in terms of versioning conventions, in terms of documentations. What do you need to showcase to, or what you need to expose, and what are your APIs doing? How is your product working? And how are you documenting that for consumption, both internally as well as externally? I think becomes very, very important. If there is a consistent style to it, most likely that would be a lot more beneficial, because you sort of have an expectation. There's a level of predictability when it comes to working with that product, or enhancing that product, or maintaining that product, as opposed to having different teams having different styles. And that, again, that's something that you need to think about, that you need to manage. Yet again, another thing that adds on to your administrative load. So that definitely has, again, benefit towards creating an efficient mechanism for development and maintenance on an ongoing basis. Second consideration would be around compliance. As we mentioned before, we are really looking at, depending on the kind of verticals we are in, depending on the kind of data that you'll be looking at, the kind of regions that you're going into, there might be requirements around adherence to specific standards. We spoke previously about data sovereignty in another talk, and that's a topic on its own, but really it looks into the kind of rules that apply to your data, both at rest and at transit, especially around the computation, storage, and processing of your information. So you need to think about that and think about how your API governance strategy or plan could sort of enable that in certain ways. It could enable keep that into consideration when on an ongoing basis when you're making changes. Then you might have more vertical based requirements. You may be working with personally identifiable information, and if you are doing that, then what do you need to do from a product development perspective? Do you need to have data masking rules in place? Do you need to have obfuscation rules or policies in place as well? So these are all some of these considerations, especially in the compliance field, because like we said, we are looking at multi-region applications now. And of course, these things come into play. And going wrong with some of the compliance requirements can have really, really long-lasting implications to the longevity of the business, as well as the reputation of the business. So with that, on to number 4, where we start looking at reporting. And at the face of it, you don't really think about this as an API governance plan. It tends to be more of an overall API initiative or API plan in itself. But it's really, really important because all of these changes and all of these things that you're putting in place, they need to be tied back to the metrics of success. You need to know if your product is still measuring up based on the performance metrics that you had put in place before. Are your KPIs being met or not? What kind of analytics can essentially help you get to that point? What kind of business decisions can you make because of these different reporting mechanisms that you now have at your disposal? The data insights that you're getting on an ongoing basis could be really, really a driving factor for making better data-driven decisions for the success of your business. And that's something that you should think about also when you're catering for your API governance strategy or plan in place. And similarly with auditing also touches upon compliance to a certain extent, where you're looking at what kind of capabilities, what kind of audit trails that you can have in place, what kind of troubleshooting mechanisms can you have in place on an ongoing basis, so that some of the things can be a little bit more self-service when it comes to external parties using your product, and some of the more internal aspects of what are the things that are going right and what could potentially go wrong can be covered here as well. So I think that's where your reporting sort of forms one of the important elements of your API governance plan. And then finally, I think this is kind of the big one where we talk about team structure, or more importantly, we're talking about ownership. Because within an organization, I think it's quite important to understand who owns the strategy, who owns the plan. Traditionally, we've seen a more central team approach when it comes to who is sort of the gatekeeper of this API governance plan. And while that worked traditionally to a certain extent, potentially even now it might work for smaller teams, smaller organizations. And in that, where you have essentially a single team, a central team that is responsible for creating this API governance plan, for having a really, really good understanding of this API governance plan, and then upholding the values of that API governance strategy, sort of almost acting as gatekeepers of the changes that are going to go through within the organization. So that was one of the previous approaches to this. Again, it could work for your organization, perhaps if you're a small scale organization working with smaller teams. But it did have some challenges because now you've got a central team that is when you're looking to scale up and you're having a larger organization with multiple teams, multiple segments, then this could potentially become a bit of a bottleneck where you're still waiting for that one central point of decision-making across your API governance plans or your change strategies moving forward. So which is where I think the newer approach or a different approach, I wouldn't say newer, but a different approach that has sort of come into existence is a little bit more of a distributed team approach, or the other terminology for this is federated team approach. And this is where you potentially look at different teams almost being responsible for their own decision-making and being self-responsible for being the gatekeepers of the API governance plan. So they themselves sort of are adhering to this plan. They contribute towards the overall API governance strategy and are also have been empowered to manage and maintain these different policies on an ongoing basis. Of course, at the face of it, this sounds a little bit better for larger organization distributed teams, but at the same time, you need to also think about the potential for failure here as well, where you do have to make sure that the different teams are on the same page when it comes to the understanding of an organization-wide API governance plan. You still want to have a degree of consistency that comes with it, but at the same time, the benefits here is really that it works a lot more independently on its own. Where you don't have that kind of bottlenecks as compared to a central team approach, especially for large-scale organizations. So I think this is another thing that you need to consider, that the ownership aspect of your API governance strategy once you have that in place. So these would be sort of the top 5 considerations that you should think about. Again, as I said, it's not exhaustive in nature. You might have more things that you might want to consider, or you might have already considered. So if you do want to talk about it, and you are watching this, perhaps leave in a comment, and that'll be quite valuable for us to understand as well, and perhaps address it for the wider audience. So with that, let's look at the next element, which is, now that we know what a potentially robust API governance plan looks like, how do you go about actually making it happen? And what could be a benefit? What could be beneficial in actually bringing this API governance plan to fruition? So today I'm going to be talking about an API management platform as an enabler for API governance. Of course, I'm in this space myself. I've been working with an API management platform for a while now, working in the space of APIs themselves for a while now. And just from a development perspective, an API management platform brings in a whole lot of things onto the table in terms of an enabler for development of APIs as it stands in itself. So today we're going to be looking at it more from a governance perspective. But just to begin, an API lifecycle management sort of entails a few different components, where you've got these API provider aspect of it, you've got an API consumer aspect of it, where you really start looking at the creation, the testing, the publishing, the security, the management, monitoring, consumption, development, discovery, all of these different aspects of an API lifecycle management. That is quite critical for the success of an API first business, because you need to be able to cater for these different stakeholders for the lack of a better word, of your product, of your API product. And that's where an API gateway or an API management platform sort of comes in as a really great addition to your overall stack. And if you look at it, typically you would have these services, potentially multiple services, that then combine to create these APIs being exposed, and that gets consumed by, say, a client layer, which could be an application, which is then being serviced to a user, essentially. And what that would mean is, essentially, you would have your services themselves having to take care of some of the more administrative aspects of things as well, including security, including the versioning, including the rate limiting, the quotas, including the retirement strategies, and all of those policies that need to be put in place. You need to sort of build those into your services. So where an API management platform sort of thrives is that acting as that middle layer, where it sort of helps to segregate out your business rules almost. So you can sort of think about your services now really focused on the business objectives of your product, and the services themselves are really tackling the different aspects of that. It could be your payments, it could be your user management, and you just focus on that. Whereas what an API gateway or an API management platform could enable you to do is to take care of some of the more administrative aspects of things, which is your security rules that you need to put in place. It could be your versioning policies that you want to put in place, your rate limiting policies that you want to put in place. All of those things could come in here. Your user group management, the kind of access controls that you want to put in place, all of that could be handled here as well. Now, the reason I sort of put in API gateway here is because typically an API management platform on a very, very typical basis tends to have 3 key components. You've got an API gateway, which sort of is responsible for most of the processing of information, processing of requests. You've got your dashboard, which takes care of more from a user provides a user interface for the administrative side of things in a lot more visual manner. It gives you a lot more information around analytics. Again, it's a little bit more on the visual aspects, the GUI side of things of your API management platform. And then the third component is the way you would expose your APIs, ones that have been developed both either internally or externally or both. And that's your developer portal. That's where you would be essentially cataloging your APIs, documenting your APIs and what they're capable of doing. So at the base level, that's the three key components that an API management platform tends to have. But over here, for illustrative purposes, I've just put in API gateway as your main root. So let's look at, now that we've sort of understood a little bit about API management platform and what kind of help or benefit that it brings in, let's look at that in the context of API governance. And we spoke about access control and who has access to what. And I think that's where, if you look at API management platforms, they typically would enable you to put these policies in place, your role-based access control policies in place. It would have user groups potentially that you can create with these different roles, different permissions, whether you want to give certain user groups access to something or you want to deny access to something, you can have all of that. Tyke definitely does this. Tyke already has this inbuilt. We are moving towards more attribute-based, to incorporate attribute-based access control as well in the future. We're going to be bringing in Open Policy Agent, or OPA, in our next iteration, which is very, very exciting, because that's again into this more sort of custom approach to API development or API maintenance, because it essentially, based on the kind of role that you have, you can, based on the different requirements, you can sort of have access to different versions of the dashboard, or different versions of the portal, or different versions of the gateway itself. Or what you can do with the data could vary, and you can focus specifically on what you want to accomplish, as opposed to being sort of melded into, thrown into all of these different other things that you might also be capable of doing, but you may not need to do at all. So it sort of takes away from the focus, and at the same time adds in a layer of guardrails once again, where you're not accidentally touching on things or doing things that you shouldn't be doing, and potentially bringing down your entire application and perhaps the business. So that's access control. That's where API management platform sort of comes in. Then ongoing maintenance and enhancement. Like we spoke before, I think we're looking at continuous improvement. What API management platform like Tyke could bring in here is API versioning. We've sort of put in a mechanism where you can have different sources. If your API version is no longer the same source with different sources, you can add those different origins to be in place. You can add retirement plans or phasing out timelines in place as well. You could potentially be looking at your different CI/CD workflows and API management platforms. Again, Tyke, we effectively work really, really well with your existing API management journey, or your API journeys around the CI/CD pipelines, and we work quite nicely in enabling your pipelines to be a lot more robust. I think we've got a couple of components that are coming in or already existing, one of which being the Tyke operator. If you haven't checked it out, it's an open source product that you could look at. And what it really does is it sort of it provides a level of developer experience that would enable you to have that CI/CD pipeline sort of built out in a robust fashion. And then finally, we're bringing in declarative API management as well. That again adds a layer of resilience on an ongoing basis. And I think if you missed out a talk by my friend and colleague Matt recently, where we talked about API automation, and these could potentially be drivers of all of that. Once you have this level of reliance and stability that is already built in, you can start looking at things where you do not need human touch points as much anymore, and you can reliably be building systems and building out your overall API portfolio on an ongoing basis. Finally, then we look at compliance. Again, adherence to compliance standards. We have API management platforms, again, can really, depending on the kind of offerings that they have, you could easily have these multi-cloud offerings where you can get up and running, started very, very quickly. But you can equally have approaches where you could have local gateways sort of handling all of these processes based on the local rules that you need to comply to. But at the same time, you could also have a central management platform that sort of enables you to orchestrate or administer your different local gateways or different local API requirements or standards requirements on an ongoing basis. And then finally, just touching upon the point of vendor agnosticism, I think it's quite important because once again, you're looking long-term with your product and your requirements could change, your needs could change. And depending on that, you might look at different cloud providers. And because you might just be getting a better deal with another cloud provider versus what you had previously. And what you do not want to get into is you do not want to get to a point where you're essentially looking at to move your entire stack completely once again, and that costing you a whole lot of time, a whole lot of money, and effectively being stuck in something that is providing less value than what it did before. So an API management platform, again, from that perspective, if you're choosing one, a more vendor agnostic approach there could be quite beneficial, where you could have a platform, a tool that works across any of these different cloud providers and can really work cohesively to bring all of your different services together, again, on an ongoing basis. And then finally, reporting mechanisms. We've got a few strong analytics tools that are in there. There are certain things that you can do directly on your dashboard. There are troubleshooting mechanisms. There are audit logs that you can look at. And further to that, we've also made it very, very easy, or in general, API management gateways try and do that as well, where we've sort of made it easy for you to plug into external tools. And these could be external tools, which could be business intelligence platforms to give you better data insights or enable better data-driven decision-making for your organization as well. So all of these these are kind of the four things that are more in tune with the API governance conversation we had previously. There's obviously a lot more that an API management platform can do, and we'll be happy to have a chat if you want to know specifically what Tyke can do, since it is an API management platform. Our gateway itself is open source and free to use if you do want to give it a shot. So finally, I think I've come close to it. I think we are sort of just about in time. As a final 4 key takeaways that we sort of touched upon. I think the first thing is really keeping things simple. And that's where I think right from the definition and understanding of API governance, where we are really looking at enabling people to do the right things easily, but making it really, really hard for people to do the wrong things and just having those guardrails around that. And that's what really the simplification process is, because simplifying the whole process of change management in an organization from a perspective of a product on an ongoing basis. Second key takeaway or consideration is really around ownership, like who owns the API governance strategy. I think that's very, very important for you to define whether a central approach works for you or whether a federated approach works for you. It's completely up to what works for you. It's not something that's a gospel. So understand that, understand your own organization, and make a choice based on that. But it is very important for team members to know where or who is responsible for this API governance plan. Then moving on to access control, who can do what within your organization? I think that is, again, another big, very, very important thing. This not only allows people, and it goes back to the simplifying of things, where once again, you're allowing people or users with specific access or permissions to do specific things and restricting them from doing things that could potentially bring down your product. And then finally, looking at tools as enablers. And I think we touched upon just API management platforms today, but there could be other tools as well that you could look at that would benefit you in your whole API governance journey on an ongoing basis. But API management tools in themselves can go a long, long way to get you started. It takes care of a lot of different aspects like versioning, like your retirement strategy, like enabling your GitOps pipelines or your CI/CD pipelines, your compliance requirements, your multi-cloud requirements, all of those things. API management platform themselves can already enable that. But beyond those as well, there could be tools for reporting that you might want to consider as well. So you may not have to do all of these things yourself. There might already be a tool out there that you can make the most use of. Then finally, as I usually do, there is one bonus takeaway, and I think this is probably the essence of the entire talk. And if there is one thing that you should take away, I think that is this, which is taking an agile approach to your API governance needs. Like we began right at the beginning, your needs are likely to change, your requirements are likely to change, your complexities might evolve or become more complex as you move along. So you cannot, having just one single API governance plan and then hoping that it's going to service you or it's going to benefit you over decades is likely not going to be the case. It's something that you need to look at, you need to consider on an ongoing basis, just like you're doing with your product. The benefit of having this agile approach is really just understanding your requirements and putting in these policies sort of still becomes an enabler for growth and change within your organization, potentially even going towards automation of certain aspects of your business, making things a lot more efficient, making things a lot more stable, making things a lot more reliable and secure as you move along. So having an agile API governance approach can go a really, really long way in terms of making a plan that is live, that is in line with the requirements of your business as they evolve over the years or even months for that matter. So that's about it. That is all that I have for you today. I hope that sort of gave you a little bit of an insight into what API governance is all about, why it is sort of important, what benefits it can bring, where an API management platform could bring benefit to you. And I now look forward to taking some of your questions.
Hi, Buddha. Thanks for that. Hi. That was a great presentation. No, I enjoyed that. I've got a couple of questions for you while people get their act together and send some in. The first one is just something I was thinking of while you were presenting. Is what happens without API governance? So, you know, people out there who are thinking maybe this isn't for me, and you know, what could happen if you don't do something along these lines?
I think that's where when we were talking initially about the evolving needs of your business and how businesses are changing and potentially in a rapid manner. So if you're really looking at multiple teams handling different aspects of your business, and what that obviously does is it's bringing a level of speed and scalability to your business, but at the same time, it's also increasing the kind of risks that go with your business, because now you've got these different teams touching your product, and potentially the likelihood of failure increases to a certain degree, where a single user, if every single one of them have administrative access to every single thing of your product, then one single click could potentially bring it all down very, very quickly. And we're not necessarily looking at a product being down for a very, very long period of time, because you might have things like disaster recovery or business continuity plans perhaps in place, which could also be part of your API governance plan. But even outages for single seconds or minutes, even those kind of small metrics could have long-lasting effects on your business. So that's definitely one of the key things around managing your risk on an ongoing basis, especially when you're expanding, to have these guardrails and having these policies in place so that not only are you looking at permissions and rules around what people can or cannot do, but at the same time, if people are doing certain things, then it can sort of flag it up a little bit better as well, and making things a lot more secure and reliable on an ongoing basis. But another key thing there also is about, when we think about bigger products or complex products, and if you give all the access to all the different team members, you're essentially giving them with a lot of tools, but a lot of tools that probably do not help them in any way. It's essentially just a whole lot of things that they now have to navigate through to get to the point of actually doing the job that they are tasked to do. So sometimes with things like having these governance rules in place, what you could have is a lot more customized approach depending on the kind of roles that you have within an organization. You might just have a very focused access to what you can do, And that is where you can sort of make the most of what your role requires you to perform in that aspect. So it's sort of an enabler or a driver of that change as well.
Perfect. Well, I'll come back with another one of mine, my questions in a minute, but there's a couple in the question box just come through. One's kind of the reverse of what we were just talking about. And I'll expand on that. I'll ask another question about can it ever, hinder things? I mean, I don't know which angle they're going. Maybe the taking away people's freedom, to do what they want by too many rules, perhaps. Is that something you would say, or the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, typically when you think about API governance, whenever the terminologies around policies and standards come in, of course, you tend to think about these are going to be hindrances to your growth. And to a certain degree, I would say perhaps that is true somewhere down the line. But at the same time, I think this is sort of foundational to how your business is scaling. So I think imagine you building a house, you want to build that house really, really quickly, but you still want to build a strong foundation for it to really scale up. Now, depending on the kind of stories or levels you want to build in, I think it'll always come down to the strong foundations that you might have within your organization. And that's where something like an API governance strategy sort of really, really comes in. And that's why I think when we started off, we talked about creating a secure, scalable, and stable product. I think that's where I think this is sort of the base of how you can get there. I think that's where API governance really puts in. Now, when we think about hindrances, I think that's, again, you need to think about the approach within your organization. It could become a hindrance if you are a large organization with multiple teams and your API governance is being handled by, say, a central team alone who has to take in the requests from so many different parts and is really becoming that bottleneck, which is where if you have a more federated approach from a team perspective, I think it becomes a lot more efficient on an ongoing basis. Again, you're empowering teams to sort of make those decisions themselves. They have a good understanding of these API governance rules that you've put in place. And that essentially becomes a driver of change, a driver of innovation, driver of scaling your product a lot more reliably. Because what you don't want to do is you're just building at speed, but again, having to take 2 steps back when something goes wrong. So what this does is you may not be taking 3 steps at a time. You might only be taking 2 steps at a time, perhaps to begin with, but those would be reliably secure 2 steps that you're taking. You're not really looking to take another step back once you've already done that. So 3 steps forward, 2 steps back is still 1 step, whereas you're still taking 2 steps here with an API governance plan in place. The final part I would talk about there is, again, do not think about API governance plans as one and done. Your requirements are likely to change. Your team structures might change, and it needs to be a living document, for the lack of a better word, but it needs to be a living thing, dynamic in nature, which sort of takes all of those things into consideration. You need to think about, okay, what is working, what is not working, and adapt accordingly. So that's where, again, that hindrance part of thing goes away, because you're continuously reviewing this document, and it's not just a mandate that has been given to you and you must follow. So it's better to sort of think about it in that fashion, where it is more really the objective of this is to drive change in a reliable manner, as opposed to be a hindrance to growth.
Perfect. Well, you kind of answered my next question to a certain extent, which was going to be about the sort of centralized team approach. And I was going to ask, that sounds like a better approach when you're dealing with a set of rules. But I was going to say, where isn't that a good idea? So if, as the company gets bigger, as the growth, the federated approach is usually more favourable then, just to cut down on these bottlenecks and and stuff like that. Would you say smaller, centralized, bigger, federated, or is that too simplified?
It's a little simplified, but I would still say, yeah, I think the larger that you go, what you're really trying to avoid, again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but what you're really trying to avoid is having these bottlenecks where you're really reliant on a central team sort of not only making those decisions, but making those decisions in an informed manner. So they need to understand every single aspects of your hugely complex product and trying to make those decisions for you, which could take a long time perhaps. And again, could be that hindrance to growth that we thought about. again, for a central, so the benefit of that obviously is that, you still have that central team that understands the governance aspect of things, and they know everything there is to know about that governance at the same point. So it is that one single point that, whatever happens, you're just going to that one team and you're done with it. But again, that becomes that bottleneck again when you're handling, you're having to manage those complexities of different teams, which is where, again, that federated approach sort of comes in, which again is not without its own challenges. Like I said, I think federated approaches, different teams, you still need to ensure that they are on the same page when it comes to the understanding of API governance plan that you have organization-wide. You need to know what the implications of your own team is going to be on the larger picture of the product, on the larger picture of the business, for that matter. So there is going to be that little thing which comes with any federated or any distributed team structure, for that matter, which is where it's very important to think about things less like cops, sort of giving you mandates, and more like coaches that, okay, this is potentially why we are doing this, and this is how you could do it, and sort of distilling that information and empowering the different teams to make those decisions better.
And for anybody out there who's thinking about API governance, but is in a situation where maybe the company's got a lot of APIs, perhaps they don't know exactly how many, perhaps they don't know exactly where they are they better off starting from scratch, or can you get a modicum of control over a bit of a higgledy-piggledy situation with data governance? Apologies for the very English situation.
I got the gist of it. No problem. I think when it comes to the implementation, it might be a little bit faster to get started, even if you don't have a whole lot going on yet. But I think it is important to sort of understand why you're sort of putting in these API governance rules in place as well in an organization. So typically, this is not something that comes up when you're really, really small and getting started. But if you do have ambitions of actually expanding or scaling out, where you might have multiple teams, where you might have multiple regions to cater for, different platforms to cater for, I think it's good to start thinking about it. I don't think there is any bad time to think about it. I don't think it's ever too late to think about it. Of course, the earlier the better is always the way to go about it, because it's an evolving thing. It's not something that you're building for 10 years down the line. You're just building it based on your needs now and potentially in the near future, and evolving as you go along. So I think capturing some of the requirements, the needs of that API governance, what it's going to address, maybe start with the 5 considerations we spoke about today as a baseline to what you should think about, would be beneficial. And then take the help of tools as well. So that's where an API management platform potentially becomes a bit beneficial, where regardless of the kind of architectures that you've built your APIs in, or the different kinds of requirements that you might have on an ongoing basis from a multi-region perspective, or compliance requirements perspective, I think just having that abstraction layer at the API management level as opposed to your business logic level actually makes it a lot more easier to move forward, because you have this API management platform now that can work very nicely and cohesively with all of these different components of your product, which have different styles, which have different requirements across different regions, and it sort of has the ability to tackle all of those for you as well. So if you want to really get up and running quick and easy, potentially having that layer of API management might be quite beneficial already.
Perfect. And final question for you, Buddha. This is a bit more of a general one, actually. We hear a lot of terminology, that's applied to businesses. Agile business, cloud native business, all this sort of stuff. We're hearing, API first business, API first strategy, that kind of terminology a lot more now. What does that mean to you? What are the advantages of it? What is an API first business? What do those businesses do different to other people?
I think the key thing there, once again, is when we talk about the whole landscape changing and it continuously changing over a period of time, I think what businesses sort of realized is you need to have a level of agility when it comes to, I'm using the term agility, but you need to have that level of speed, almost, for the lack of a better word, speed towards innovation, when you're trying to build out your product, when you're trying to build out a product not as a one shot, but essentially a product that is a living thing, which is essentially growing and evolving over a period of time. I think that's where it becomes quite important to think about how you can sort of manage that. And I think where initially it was perhaps a little bit more of an application-driven approach. We were building out an application and that's being consumed. I think now we are looking at a lot more of a service sort of driven approach, where you do have an application, you do have a product which has a lot of different consumptions. You have a lot of different touch points, like we mentioned before. So you're no longer just building it for a web product, essentially. You're building out for all of these different things. And then you've got different components underlying that product of yours, which need to be taken care of on their own individual basis, and which again contribute towards the scalability and growth of your business. So instead of having a one-shot sort of monolithic sort of an approach, you've sort of gone into these different tiered approaches where you've got this front end or the application which is trying to consume information and really doesn't care how you're building that out. And then you've got these back end, which is essentially built out in any potential way that your team essentially decides. But at the end of the day, what it really, the output of that tends to be that you have this API that is just providing the service for consumption. So if it is a payment service, then it's giving you all of the different mechanisms around payments itself. If it's user management, then it's giving all the things around user management. And that sort of level of different abstraction has enabled businesses to scale up a lot faster than they could before. And so now if you were to just incorporate yet another, say, touch point, for instance, you're not having to change your entire stack completely, but you're just adding on another touch point at all, because it will potentially be working with the similar APIs. Again, underlying APIs may not change. You might look at additions perhaps in the future, but your underlying data interaction APIs might still be pretty much the same as you move along. And similarly, on the back end perspective, you might just be looking at that, just adding on new services, which can then be very reliably consumed by your application without having to think about how has it been done and what languages, what styles, and all of those things. It's a lot more reliable and scalable method of moving forward, and that's why it has become a lot more popular.
Perfect. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions. I think I'm going to have to call it time now. We'll get back to you on those questions. So thank you for sending them in. We'll make sure somebody sends an answer over to you. But I'd also like to say thanks to Buddha. It's been a pleasure having you again. Until next time, and thank you everybody at home for watching. And we'll be back very shortly, I imagine. All right. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Buddha. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.